Hello and welcome along to another episode of the United Daily. It's Ben here on All for United. Thank you for joining me this lunchtime. I'm so thrilled to have the panel I have joining me for a chit chatter today. Do you know how we like to do things here? We like to educate, we like to inform, but we like to reflect on not just the United now, but how we got there from yesteryear. And I'm really excited for today's show. You would have seen Roy Cavanagh. He says I have to mention the MBE. So Roy Cavanagh MBE, an historian, is on the show. We've got John Gubba, who's always fantastic. And to be honest, John, we haven't done a show where we reflected on the past really before. We've already spoken about the current. You said to me you'd love to do one, so it's great to have you on today. And Tony, I don't know if you remember, but about 6 years ago, I think we last done a show together on a channel called The United View, talking about United and the MUJacs, and it was ages ago. So it's fantastic to be talking to you again, mate, and it's fantastic to have you on this show because, you know, with the Real Sociedad game, I think it opened our eyes. Real Sociedad, a team a bit like United, who are enriched in history of using their homegrown players. And afterwards, there was a lot of talk and chatter around the consecutive games. Over 80 years now, Manchester United have used homegrown academy talent in their matchday squads, which is remarkable. And we'll come to actual figure on games in just a moment's time. I'm sure someone will shout it out very loud. But first of all, I want to come around to each of you. Roy, when I say Manchester United, homegrown talent is one of the things, isn't it? Using our academy talent is one of the things that's enriched in our DNA. For you, is there a Manchester United without the tradition within youth and our academy that we have to this point in time?
No, I've not seen it. I mean, my first game was youth game was 1954, 55, and of course the 50s was the Busby Babes. The 60s was Georgie Best and that team. The 70s, even though they didn't have much success in winning FA Youth Cups, they produced 7 or 8 top players, Sammy Mack, Jimmy Greenough, etc. The 80s was Norman and Mark Hughes, Clayton Blackmore. Then the 90s was the class of 92. So, you know, and then of course, even now, as Tony and John will explain, the number of games that had a youth team. And that was amazing on Thursday night when at any one stage you had Henderson, Williams, Tunazabe, I can't pronounce him.
Terry.
Yeah, that's the one. Hamid, who's obviously only just joined us, Rashford, Greenwood. I may have missed the odd. No, Matt Tommedy didn't play, did he? But, you know, they were all on the pitch at some stage or other. Absolutely incredible.
I think, wasn't it, half of the outfield team at the end of the game were academy graduates, which was just stunning. It's fantastic to see. John, for you, the love for this football club and the way we do things is part of that power, how we use our own, how we blood in our own, and how enriched that is within our DNA.
Absolutely, as you said, I mean, it's very much part of our DNA. And for me, there isn't a Man United without having youth team players coming through. And that's one of the things that excites me the most about Ollie's era, really, because he fully gets that. And the one thing I get frustrated with, really, is the modern day fan just wants instant success, and they don't seem to be patient with the young players, and they criticise them too easily. I mean, Marcus Rashford is still a young kid. I mean, he's a great player, and he can get better. But if he does something wrong, you've got social media and people on his back all the time. And I think I just like younger fans to be a little bit more patient and to be a little bit more aware of our history, and to understand what it is to be a Manchester United player and also what it is to be a Manchester United fan.
Yeah, 100%. And Tony, similar question to you. I know you are enriched in our history when it comes to United blood in the youth and how we've done it through the years. For you, Tony, where we are today, how that DNA has, so to speak, grown, Manchester United using academy players, how that tradition has carried on as well. Let's face it, it would have been easy for someone like a Jose Mourinho or a Louis van Gaal, or even at the point David Moyes. I mean, I know luckily enough Adnan Januzaj was in some sort of form at that point, so he was always going to get in the team. It would have been easy for them to have gone, do you know what, especially with the Woodward model, as he said at the time, we're going to turn into this Galactico side. It would have been easy for them to have gone, right, we don't need to use that player, and so to speak, stumble over what all the managers beforehand have built when it comes to tradition. For you, is that how powerful this club is and how rich that DNA, as we've mentioned before, blooding in the youth, using the academy?
I think so, Ben, and I think there's two aspects to look at it here. I think you're right by saying, look at the first team manager and what do they believe in youth? Do they not believe in youth? I think the other thing that we must always remember is we've had a great pedigree of having youth coaches who are really, really good at their job. So regardless of what's happening at first team level, you've got that undercurrent of coaching and the coaching staff. And in the 50s and 60s, you probably had a handful of people. Now you go down to Carrington, there's 20, 30, 40, 50 coaches. All of those people are working really hard behind the scenes to push these young kids forward. And I think that's the bit that's interesting for me just as much as the first team manager, is how those people are producing them, coaching them, developing whatever words you want to use. And that's been part of our culture for just as long as the first team managers. In fact, probably even more. Some of those coaches going all the way back to the 30s and during the Second World War. And I'd like to just recognise that, the likes of Jimmy Murphy and Eric Harrison and many, many others, to the modern day stuff, the Paul McGuinnesses, the Tony Whelans, the Colin Littles, and a whole bunch of others I've not mentioned, Jimmy Ryan and so forth. And those people, they're just as entrenched and steeped in the history as the Solskjaers and the Tommy Dochertys and the Matt Busbys.
Let's go back there, Tony. I think you're the best person to talk about this. We know your name on Twitter, Mr. Mujac, and I think this is the perfect question for you. You're talking then about the culture and where it all started. Please, for anyone out there who's young, who's listening, Tom Clare said this before. A lot of people think that this tradition started with the Babes, but it actually came before that. Give us an insight and a bit of information and a learning curve on where you believe the foundations were set for Manchester United to thrive when it comes to blooding in young players and utilising the academy.
Well, first of all, what I've discovered in the last year or so doing my research is that the first actual youth team was in 1902-03. The same time we changed our name from Newton Heath to Manchester United. We had a youth team in one of the junior leagues in the Manchester and District League. And upon doing that research, it was absolutely fascinating. Of course, it was over 100 years ago. You don't have all the players' names or anything like that, but you've got the results in the newspapers. And I just thought that was really interesting. Why did that happen? And maybe we'll never know. The ledgers at Old Trafford don't seem to have existed. The war fires. So we don't know what happened there. All we know is we had a junior team in that league. But then when Gibson took over in the early 30s, he was very keen to have a club that was based of Manchester players. And this has been written about many times, how our chairman at the time, Mr. Gibson, wanted, local lads getting a chance. And at that time, very, very few clubs, if any, were able to support a junior team. For example, Preston and Burnley had some junior teams in their leagues, in their local leagues. You might have had one or two in the south as well, but it wasn't something that most clubs did for very obvious reasons. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the facilities to have investing in training grounds around the local area. They didn't have the coaching staff. There was no infrastructure. But in the early 30s in Manchester, Gibson decided to invest in the infrastructure. So they had at the time a first team, and then you had a reserve team, which was the Central League. And that Central League was pretty rough and tumble. You couldn't just take a 15-year-old, 16-year-old kid out of school and put them in the Central League. It just wouldn't have worked. They would have got kicked off the park. So what clubs tended to do was pick up players from non-league clubs. So a lad would leave school at 15, 16. He'd play for his local team. His local team could be, just a boys' club. But then someone like, if I'm using the example of in the Manchester area, a team such as Hyde United or Altrincham or one of those other bigger non-league clubs would have picked that young boy up, played him for 2 or 3 years until he physically developed. And then the local professional clubs who were scouting would see that player, bring them forward and put them into the Central League team. But in the late 20s, early 30s, they had what they called a midweek league. And the midweek league was designed by mostly the northern clubs to try to use trialists and young players without putting the pressure on them of signing up as a full-time pro. So they're often signed as amateurs and given a run out. And then if they found they had any talent, they would progress. But even then, during those periods from, say, mid-20s to mid-30s, 1930s, the leagues were too hard. We were playing Burnley, where you had a bunch of lads in that Burnley team, for example, who were first-team players trying to come back from injury, who'd lost form, were trying to get back into the first team. You can imagine what the money was like during the 1930s. So these players were very keen on earning as much money as possible. So they they didn't give the youngsters a chance. So what Gibson did was he said, there's a Manchester League where we're playing the likes of Denton, Altrincham Reserves, Glossop. So it wasn't the same, what's the right word? The same pressure on young boys, and it wasn't as physical. And then all of a sudden, these youngsters who were 17, 18, maybe a couple of years older as well, got the chance to get in there and find their rhythm and their form. And then what started to happen was we started to see this trickle effect. So the likes of Jackie Wassell, Tommy Manley, Johnny Carey, one or two others would start out in the A-League, the A team in the Manchester League, get their form, find out what it was like to build their strength against, sometimes works teams who were pretty powerful. But for the most part, it was a balance of youth and experience. And that was a fantastic breeding ground to allow these young players to develop. And then what started to happen, I think, is as we started to get the trickle effect, and we got a lot of good coaches in that period as well, ex-players who were coaches, people like Ted Connor, who used to be a player at United, Jimmy McClelland, who was a player at United. These ex-pros would go into the coaching for the A-team as part of their coaching program, their coaching experience. And then all of a sudden, this trickle effect started to take shape. But what happened in terms of the real pinpoint was Walter Crickmer and Louis Rocker in about 1937 spoke to the chairman and they said, why can't we start this off in a completely different way? Why don't we start at schoolboy level? Why don't we get in touch with all the schoolmasters of all the schools, all the best schools in the local areas, and get the kids who are 14 and 15 just coming out of school and get them playing for Manchester United? Because if we can get those players breathing, living, and thinking about Man United as the club for them, then we're going to have loyalty. We're going to have all the things that go with not just supporting a football team, but playing for your football team. It must be like players now in the foundation and the academy, they're young kids and they're putting on a Man United shirt. That feeling just must be, so amazing. But going back to the 1930s, the Depression, to do that back then must have just blown kids' minds away. I remember talking to Jack Smith, who was one of the original MUJACs in 1937, 38. And he said, they didn't have money to go to games. They used to wait till 3/4 time and then nip in to see the last 20 minutes of the game. They couldn't afford a program. I remember saying to Jack, well, who was your favorite heroes at the time? Stanley Matthews or Wright Carter? And he says, no. He says, we never even knew them. And I said, well, didn't you read about them in the paper? And he says, we couldn't afford newspapers. He said, my father had 6 or 7 children. Even though there were newspapers around, obviously, we couldn't afford to buy newspapers. So we never read about all these famous players. The only famous player was Bill Mackay or, Stan Pearson or Jack Rowley, who were already established in the first team at the outset of the Second World War. And it was an amazing thing, Ben, just to listen to him talk about what it must have been like as a young boy, a 15-year-old, to be playing for Manchester United. And I think that's when the tide turned. Because Walter Crickmer in that first season, they won the Charlton League, they got to the final of the Gilchrist Cup, they won the A-League Championship, the Central League team won the Central League. All of a sudden, that year, things turned, and Walter Crickmer and the manager at the time had left a couple of seasons earlier, Scott Duncan. So Walter was basically looking after first-team affairs as the secretary/manager, and I think Walter Crickmer was the catalyst. I think he suddenly realised, I'm onto something here. I've got something that can make a huge difference in our community, in the city, but also at our football club. And that is just an amazing epiphany, if you like, of where it all started for me.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because as you mentioned there, to really put this into context, you've got to think about the world everyone was living in back then as well in the 30s. As you mentioned, then the Great Depression, money wasn't around like it is, so to speak, now as well. I think I was reading before the show, doing some research, he put something like 20, 30 grand into the club. But that's all they could afford to do so at the time. And didn't the previous owner before that die or something in his first 4 to 5 years owning the club? And then, as you said, he had some fantastic managers. And Roy, it comes on perfectly to Matt Busby, who was obviously who obviously took over in the late
45.
40s, yeah, 45, and the Babes, and it carried on the tradition of bringing youth players through. Let's carry on. The tradition continued, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Tony's laid a very good script out there, and it's so interesting and so true. The first year after the war, 1946 season, when United came second, I'm pretty sure the reserves won the Central League. And allegedly, Matt said to Jimmy Murphy, well, who we got in the reserves that can come into the first team?
Now, and we about having articles ready because
someone's got the show open. Oh, there we go. I think it's been put. There you go. Sorry, carry on, Roy.
Okay. And Matt allegedly asked Jimmy who we got in the reserves that have just won the Central League that could come into the first team. And Jimmy said, well, there's nobody because they're all 26, 27. Don't forget they'd missed 6 or 7 years of their lives with the war and they weren't going to improve anymore. And I really think one of the big moments after what Tony's talked about was the start of the FA Youth Cup in 1952-53. And that was perfect because in the time between, say, 50 and 52, Busby, Murphy and all the others, Bert Wally, they'd really researched around the country and they brought all these young lads through for that youth team and started in 1952-53. I think what's really interesting is the very first FA Youth Cup game was against Leeds United, and one of the goal scorers for United was a guy called Charlton. But it wasn't Bobby Charlton, it was his brother Jack, who scored an own goal for Leeds in that match. And then United won the FA Youth Cup 5 years on the bounce, and probably would have won it 6 years, but for the Munich air disaster, because they were again in the semi-final when the crash happened. But going back, the first time I actually went to a youth team game, I seriously, can you still remember it? It was against Plymouth Argyle. It was in March 1955, and the game kicked off at 11 o'clock in the morning, with the reserves kicking off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And in that United side was Eddie Coleman, Duncan Edwards, Wilf McGuinness, Shea Brennan, and Bobby Charlton. Now, Duncan Edwards played in that match at number 5. He was centre half. 3 weeks after that game, he made his England debut against Scotland. That shows how incredible Busby thought about the youth team. And again, around that time, a lot of clubs actually were complaining that Matt shouldn't be playing the likes of Duncan Edwards in his youth team because, he'd just been picked for England at 17. But Matt quite rightly did play them. And I don't know what the other guys think, but like last season, we got to the semi-final and we didn't play Greenwood in the semi-final against Chelsea. Well, we could have done. I mean, he's eligible to play. He's only eligible to play for about 2-3 years at the most. And I think the Youth Cup is very, very important. But that game with Plymouth United won 9-0, won the Cup again. The following season, around the same time, March, we played a team called Bexley Heath. And Bexley Heath were actually the academy side of Charlton Athletic. By this time, people wanted to see that youth team. And so what they did, they switched the youth game to the Saturday afternoon. And the youths kicked off, the reserves kicked off at 11 o'clock on that Saturday morning. This time, there was 23,000 watching the game against Bexley Heath. United won comfortably 11-1. Bobby Charlton got 5 goals, and it put them into the semi-final. And the final that season was against Chesterfield. Now, Bobby Charlton obviously played in that side, and in the Chesterfield goal, 1956, was Gordon Banks. And incredibly, 10 years after, of course, 1966, Charlton and Banks played in the England side that won the World Cup. So some great, great memories from my era, watching the team with Duncan in, Coleman, Wilf, Bobby, Albert Scanlon, Shea Brennan, all players like that. And then later on, Nobby came in, Johnny Giles, Alex Dawson, who was an awesome goal scorer, awesome. Mark Pearson, who was a beautiful inside left. And of course, they were deprived probably of winning it in 58 because the crash happened. And of that youth team, Gaskell, Dawson and Pearson, certainly Dawson and Pearson were playing regularly in the first team after the crash. So they couldn't play in the semi-final and they got beat by Wolves.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke there a little bit about Roy spoke there a bit about the team, John, and spoke there a little bit about Sir Matt and how the legacy continued. Tony mentioned in there that the 30s and Gibson, but I think one name that we do have to hit on, and I know you've done many programs on this man, is Jimmy Murphy, and the role he played and how much the younger players loved him, and especially after the disaster, how he managed to pick the club up using quite a few young players, but also giving them the confidence to continue playing under such hard circumstances. How big an influence is Jimmy Murphy when it comes to moulding that DNA now we have, John?
Absolutely, yeah. I'd like to say first, I'm totally in awe of both Roy and Tony.
Same.
Superhuman. I mean, I'm sitting here like a fan. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. First thing I'm going to do when we finish this show is watch it back, because I'm learning so much, and there's no way I can compete with these guys for knowledge about the old days. And it is absolutely fascinating. And it's great that you've got a platform like this, because there's no other way you can find out this information from the spoken word. And you're doing a great service by having this strand of programs that you're doing. I think it's absolutely fantastic. But I've got to know more about Jimmy Murphy as a program maker, as a filmmaker, and I've got quite close to the Murphy family. I know you've had Paul Murphy on the show before. He's a very good friend of mine, and I know his twin brother Stephen and Michael, and his father Nick. And I've got to know about Jimmy Murphy through making films. I mean, I did a lot of interviews for the Jimmy Murphy film that was put out on MUTV. And what's fascinating is every time you talk to somebody who remembers Jimmy Murphy or played for Jimmy Murphy or played it in a team against Jimmy Murphy, was the character of Jimmy Murphy. How it was almost like he was running a separate team within Manchester United, running the youth team, and he was the king of the youth team. And all the players that went through to the first team, and obviously he was Sir Matt's right hand man with the first team, but he had this unique role really, and everybody was in awe of him because he was like this sergeant major, and that's how obviously how Matt Busby often said that he probably his best ever signing was Jimmy Murphy, because he saw him when he was in the army, and how he used to sort of command young people, and he had the respect of young people. But everybody from Bobby Charlton and Duncan. I mean, I don't remember Duncan Edwards, of course, because he was killed in the crash the year before I was born. But I know about Duncan Edwards and being the director of Duncan Edwards Foundation. And I think going back to something that Roy mentioned a little while ago about how these players used to play for the first team, but they also used to play for the youth team. And I think that's something that's missing today. I just wanted to quickly mention that as I remembered it. But yeah, I mean, Jimmy Murphy, I mean, he was such a unique guy in the history of Manchester United. And we don't have a figure like Jimmy Murphy. We're not had a figure like Jimmy Murphy since we had Jimmy Murphy. And he was very much taken for granted. And, like I'm kind of like harking on about the Jimmy Murphy campaign, which I kind of got involved with. And I think it's all part of this learning curve for younger fans. I mean, I'm old, but I've got a young head on me, and I'm more knowledgeable about things that have happened since I started watching. I'm not really a historian in the way that Roy and Tony are, because they've studied this to immense detail. But the thing about Jimmy Murphy is all the players look up to him, and it was kind of a unique training ground for the first team because of Jimmy Murphy, the character that he was. He was like a second father to most of the players, and he was very strict, and he put the fear of God up players, and but at the same time, I kind of think that Sir Alex Ferguson was possibly a similar sort of personality in that he frightened the death out of players, but they all looked up to him and respected him like a father figure. And for me, that's the impression I've always had of Jimmy Murphy. And the more that I've got to know about him through the family and the people that I've interviewed. I remember interviewing Cliff Jones, who played in the double Spurs, and he was talking about Jimmy Murphy, because obviously he was his national team manager, and he was saying that about when Jimmy Murphy told you what to do, you didn't. You did exactly what you said, and they all lived in fear of him, but they all respected him and loved him. That was the thing, really. It was a sort of love for Jimmy Murphy. It wasn't just a fear of Jimmy Murphy. But one of the things that Cliff Jones talked about was he played in an army team, and in that army team was Cliff Jones, striker, double winner, Welsh hero for his national team, Bobby Charlton, Duncan Edwards, and Eddie Coleman. That was an army team. I mean, he said, what a fantastic team that was. And it just like, I absolutely find it fascinating to hear these stories from these older guys and to hear about these people, and it kind of brings them to life. And that's what I'm hoping. As you know, I'm making a film or trying to make a documentary series. It's going to be called We Will Never Die, and Jimmy Murphy's very much a central character in that. So I'm finding out as I go along, and two men I need to interview for this film, I think, is going to be Tony and Roy, because they know so much and they can bring this era to life, which is what
100%.
they speak.
And that stuff, as you say, it never disappears. If as soon as you get it online, that's it. You're informing the next generation and the generation after that, and that's really, really important. We keep mentioning the word DNA, and you mentioned there, we'll never die, and these are the foundations and the reason on why we will never die, because of how we approach it and how our club is structured, and those who have laid down those foundations beforehand. And it's extremely important for people to learn that. Well, John, quickly then, let's hit on. I want to come back and talk more about the Babes. I want to talk more as well with Tony about a little bit earlier on as well, and I want to get onto the class of '92 as well, which is slightly more current than some of the players today coming through the academy. But what about the 70s and 80s? I know we're looking at 2 decades there, John, and potentially a load of players that could be mentioned. But for you, the 70s and 80s, how did we embed the youth then? Do you remember any potential standout moments where you saw exciting young players and so to speak, the club evolutionised during those 20 years?
My own personal memories of the 70s and 80s is more a case of the fact that you used to go to youth team games and reserve team games to collect the tokens. And what was outstanding was you get to these games and there'd be like these massive crowds, bigger crowds than you'd see at other first team games. And it was fantastic. There would be a lot of people that just turn up, get the program and go, but I'd always stay. And I don't remember so much specific games because you're only really sort of storing your memory bank more the first team games. But I remember you see Arthur Albertson on the bus and it was a different era because you were more closer to the players. So you'd see a guy playing at Old Trafford. The next minute you see him on the bus or you see him in the pub. And that was one of the things that stood out for me. I mean, I remember more the 80s in Norman Whiteside and Mark Hughes coming through the youth team because I thought they're going to be outstanding players. I mean, obviously Norman didn't play for the youth team that long because he was straight into the first team, and he was playing for the first team when he was 17. I think it was Amad Diallo beat his record, didn't he, last week?
Shola Shoretiri, wasn't it?
Shola Shoretiri broke his record. I think he was only 17 years and was it 23 days. But I remember Norman Whiteside, I'm thinking, crikey, he's a fantastic player. I mean, basically he was a man when he was a boy, a bit like Wayne Rooney. And that was kind of a memory there. I mean, my boyhood hero was Georgie Best. So even though I don't remember him playing for the youth team, I was always aware of the fact that he'd come through the youth team. And George was very much my hero. So that was my memory, really, of following his progress, thinking, crikey, we've got some good players here.
Only a few. Here we go, guys. I'll test you here then. How old was Norman Whiteside when he made his European debut? Can anyone remember the exact age?
So that would have been September 81, September 82 against Valencia. He would have made his debut. So he was born in May 65. So do the math. He would have been 18
younger.
Months.
Younger.
17 4 months.
More or less 17 and 1 month. So he was 17 years old and 23 days when he made his European debut for Manchester United. Yeah, and Shoretiri, I think, was 21 days. So 17 and 21 days. So beat it by a couple of days, I think, if that's right.
But Norman never looked 17. I mean,
whereas Shoretiri looked 60.
Yeah, I mean, he was, he's just physical, once he put a bloody good player and a top bloke as well.
And he actually celebrated the fact that his record got broken on Twitter as well. I don't know if you saw, he messaged, he put a message out to Shoretiri saying someone had to do it someday. Well done, kid. And I think that was really, really nice that actually Norman got to see his record be broken as well. I think that must be quite nice. Although maybe as a footballer, because of how competitive are you, like, now I want to keep that. I don't want that to go anywhere. Who knows?
Norman's still got plenty of records. He's
yes, of course.
The World Cup. Yeah.
Youngest goal scorer, youngest player in the final. He's got plenty of records.
If I'm going to let one go, I'll let that one go. He's probably thinking sat at home watching the game.
Ben, can you just go back to one point John made? And
God,
I'm sure Tony's heard the same story. But I got to know Harold Bratt very well. Now, not many will know Harold Bratt. He only played one game for United, and that was against Bradford City in the League Cup in about 1960. But Harold actually was in the reserve team the Saturday before the air crash. And he was a bloody good left half with Harold. And he told me a lovely story about Jimmy. And they played Huddersfield Town. Remember, United didn't lose a game for about 4 years in the FA Youth Cup, and they were playing away at Huddersfield on a wet and windy day, and they were going over the moors in the coach. He said, and suddenly Jimmy came down the coach to talk to me, and I thought, whoops, it's a bit funny. He said, look, he said, they've got an inside right. He said, he's wearing National Health Service glasses, and he's got a plaster over one of side. He's about 6 stone, but do not let him out of his sight. And Harold's thinking this, and he gets on the pitch, and there's this young inside right in a Huddersfield Town shirt with his spectacles on and a plaster over one eye. Anyhow, United are 2-0 down, and Harold's looking across, looking at the dugout was on the other side, and he's thinking, oh no, this guy's running riot here. United got a goal back just on our time. We go in the dressing room, and Harold's thinking, oh no. So, but Jimmy just said, look, I'm not even going to talk to you. He said, the first one of you that's nearest to that inside right in the second half, you put him out of the game. And he said, Mark Pearson stood on his foot in about the second minute. And it was Dennis Law, of course, limped away, and United finished up winning 4-2. But I mean, Jimmy's attention to detail and everything John said about him. Here is a man who went in the pub with the locals, had a fag, had a pint, and, you know, was, well, indescribable.
Some man from all the stories I've heard. Tony, do you want to chip in on Jimmy?
Just to follow on that, Roy, my understanding was Jimmy then went to Matt Busby and said, you've got to sign this kid. And Matt Busby actually put a bid in for Dennis Law before Dennis was 18 years old. But Bill Shankly, who was the manager, said no chance.
£10,000 he offered after the game. £10,000. And of course, Dennis then went to City. United couldn't afford him when he went to City. It was just after Munich. We didn't have the money. We just bought Albert Quicksall, 45,000. And we got that, I think, from Louis Edwards. He went to City, and then he went to Torino, and we couldn't afford him then. But when we did sign him, Matt Busby had actually managed him before we signed him, and because Matt was the Scotland manager. I've not 100% had this guaranteed, but United played Everton in 1958 at Goodison on a Saturday afternoon, and Dennis made his debut for Scotland. But Matt Busby was the Scotland manager, and Jimmy Murphy was the Wales manager on that day. So God knows who was managing the United team when they played at Everton that afternoon. Well, we're talking of legends here. Dennis Law, Matt Busby, and Jimmy Murphy is way, way, way up there. He's not looking down to them. He's way up there.
Yeah, we've done obviously a whole program on Jimmy Murphy. He just comes across like a phenomenal man who needs to get that recognition he deserves at Old Trafford. Shout out to Patrick and the Manchester Munich Memorial Foundation and the board and the panel there who are doing everything they can to make sure, and I think the club are as well, to their credit, to make sure that the right kind of tribute is actually happening at Old Trafford for Jimmy Murphy. Tony, let me come over to you quickly, and I want to really just hit on the class of '92 ever so quickly, and we'll go around the panel on this one. Obviously, for the younger generation of fans, straight away names that would come to mind would be the Beckhams, the Giggs, the Skulls, the Nevilles, and you know, the treble winning sides. You can just keep listing them and keep listing them. But for you, you know, the 90s and United, obviously when it comes to it, those are always going to be the players that are mentioned. Are there any other players that potentially don't get the limelight for you from that era? And also, you know, from the moment that Sir Alex Ferguson took over, just seemed like the perfect combination between club and manager to again carry on that tradition.
Yeah, I think so. What's really interesting with the class of '92 is, and it's weird, it's a really weird one, the one player who was the standout player in that team, apart from Ryan Giggs, and you've got to remember Ryan Giggs had already played a couple of seasons in the first team before the '92 FA Youth Cup final against Crystal Palace. So he had played part of 1991, 91, 92. So he was an established first team player. The player that was the real standout in that team was Nicky Butt. And he was by far and wide the one that Alex Ferguson thought, I don't need Paul Ince. I've got Nicky Butt coming through. The David Beckhams, I mean, David couldn't even get in that youth team in 1991, 92. Robbie Savage was ahead of him for most of the...
Didn't he go on loan, Tony? He went on loan, didn't he, for a season?
Yeah, 94 he went on loan to, 93, 94 he went on loan to Preston North End. David Beckham was we all know how good David Beckham was, so I'm not disrailing David Beckham in any way. What I'm saying is, at that moment in time, Nicky Butt was the standout. He was running the show in all those games. He was a man playing a boys' game. And I remember going to those early Youth Cup games in the early 90s. Adrian Doherty is another one who unfortunately was injured. He was almost like the equivalent of Giggs on the other wing. So you had Giggs on one wing and Adrian Doherty on the other. And Oliver Kay's written a very good book about Adrian Doherty that I'd recommend to anybody to have a read of, which is going into all the history of Adrian's career and what happened in his life. And Forever Young is the book called, and I recommend that. But, you had Doherty on one side and you had Giggs on the other, and they were just, unbelievable. But Nicky Butt came through, and I just thought, here is a lad who, and people, I think even today, he's a very underrated midfielder in our history. He doesn't get the recognition I think he deserves. He was a cracking player. And of course, Paul Scholes couldn't get into that 92 team either. He was smaller than the rest of the lads. He was suffering from asthma at the time. So he came through really the season after. And then obviously Phil Neville was 1995. But they all get grouped together because, they had that camaraderie. And in anything, I think what happened, people often say, United have had the class of 92, that'll never happen again. And I disagree with that fundamentally. I think if you actually analyze our history, we've had groups of kids come through virtually every decade. So, there were 7 or 8 of them in the 40s. You had the Busby Babes in the 50s. In the 60s, in terms of just the 1968 team, you had, Nobby Stiles, you had George Best, Francis Burns, Brian Kidd, David Sadler, Steve James. You had 6 or 7 or 8, Carlos Sartori. You had so many players all in that team at the same time. Then in the 70s, you've got the McElroys, the McCrearys, the Greenoffs, the Nichols, the Orbistons, the Andy Richies. There's another 7 players. So when people say the class of 92, yes, they were exceptional. I think what made them exceptional was they actually grew up together like the Babes. All the other groups, they were slightly different in age. So there was a degree of, they had their own pals in a different team. The 80s was pretty close. You had the Blackmores, the Whitesides, the Billy Gartons, Graham Hogg, McGarvey, Alan Davies, Mickey Duxbury. They were all pretty tight as well because they'd come through the same years. I think what made the class of 92 special was that friendship that they had. And it was really interesting for me, and this, I don't know how often this gets talked about, because the first team was so good back in 94. I think a lot of people would suggest that our team in 1993-4 was one of the double winning team, was probably the best team that we ever had in the Ferguson era. There's a lot of people who will argue that. And I understand why. It had everything: pace, power, et cetera, skill, whatever. But I think those boys, because they were made to wait a little bit, that made them really hungry, but they were hungry together. So all of a sudden you had this momentum being built behind the scenes. So when they got there, they just didn't want to lose their spot. As a group, they didn't want to lose their spot. So all of a sudden you had this traction and momentum that was just very unique since the Busby Babes, even though we'd continually developed decade upon decade upon decade, loads of kids coming through the system and reaching the first team. It didn't happen in the same way. It was more of an integrated process. Whereas the 50s and probably the 40s as well, but no one talks about the 40s. But the 50s and the 90s, it was almost like there was this wait. I mean, Roy will know this as well. Bobby Charlton was so frustrated after playing 100 reserve team games. Why am I not in the first team? Why am I not? And they developed hunger. And I think that hunger is the differentiating factor between groups of players and individual players coming through. So, to answer your question directly, Ben, I think the one player that, even though he made it and is highly recognised, would be Nicky Butt. He was just by far in advance of everybody else in 92.
I also think some of the work Nicky Butt is doing right now with the youth academies and the youth sides is absolutely phenomenal. I personally don't think it'd be too long that if we do go down that director of football route, I think there's a name at the club already who could be perfect for that role, and I think he's showing it by the way that he is developing the academies and the way he's playing. And the only thing that may hold that back is because it looks like he loves being out on that training pitch as well. So maybe that's for something for him to go in his head. John, let me come over to you quickly again on the 90s for you, the class of 92. Any fond memories? Anything that you want to hit on that Tony hasn't hit on?
No, as I say, I kind of forget I'm on the panel at some points because they're so fascinating, got so much knowledge. But one player I'd like to mention who never made it really was Ben Thornley, because there was a time when Nobby Stiles was asked who was the best player in the youth team, and he had Giggs, and he had Scholes, and he had Beckham, and he had Nicky Butt, but he said Ben Thornley. And Ben Thornley, I've seen footage of him, and he looked like Ryan Giggs, and he was a fabulous football player at that age. And it was such a tragedy that he had that bad injury. And he obviously he's got his book out, which you can read about it. And I just think Ben is a fantastic character, and he sort of gives you a good insight. I mean, I know Ben quite well, so he gives you a good insight into what it was like in the class of '92. And also Chris Casper, whose father played for Burnley. I remember his dad playing for Burnley, and Chris Casper was another good young player. And a lot of fans don't know about these guys being in the class of '92. They know all the star names that we talk about all the time. But also I'd like to mention Nicky Butt, and what you've already mentioned, the role that he's playing at the moment. I think it's fantastic that we've got this continuity, and we've got Nicky Butt with such a pivotal role with the youth team. I think that's fantastic, and that's one of the things that impresses me really with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, how he's seen that, and he's got all the right people around him. And again, as Tony said, when people say we'll never have another class of '92 and we'll never have that amount of players together, I think he's right when he says we will. I mean, I think we've got it at the moment in all possibility. Obviously, it's about being patient, and that's one of the things that Tony mentioned as well, about being patient and giving them the hunger. And fans are so impatient these days. I mean, Mason Greenwood had a fantastic season last year, and then fans expect him to be playing every week this season, but that's not the way it goes. And Fergie was always great at that. He was always good at protecting the players. And if you have to look at Michael Owen at Liverpool, I mean, Michael Owen would have had a much better career in my mind if he hadn't been burnt out by Liverpool, by them being too impatient. So I think it's important that fans are more patient with players and let them develop, and trust the managers, to get it right, because they're working with these guys every day. And it's not all about, we live in a world now, we want instant success. And that's one of my biggest bugbears, that people have no patience, and you've got to think about the long term. And that it's not just Ollie, of course. He's got this whole team around him, and I think you have to give a little bit of credit really to the management. Really, I know it's always very popular to criticise the owners and criticise the management, but maybe it's for financial reasons. They think let's concentrate on the young players, but I don't think it is that. I think they actually get it, and I think people forget about Louis van Gaal, because Louis van Gaal's role was to develop the young players. I mean, Louis van Gaal has still got the youngest team that ever won the European Cup, Champions League as it is now. His Ajax team, if you look at that Ajax team, it's like a who's who of football. And his job really was to do what he did for Ajax with Manchester United. But then there was a worrying moment where United panicked when Pep Guardiola went to City, and United thought we'd better get Jose Mourinho. And that for me was a disaster, because we did a complete U-turn. We went from developing the young kids to all of a sudden we've got a manager who wasn't really interested in the long-term success of Manchester United. It was all about what's going to go on his CV. He wants instant players who are ready now, disposable players almost, that we can have a team that's going to win us a trophy this season and not think about the future. So I think that's what makes the United job so much more difficult than people realise. It's not just about being successful at the moment. It's about building for the long term. And I think with the structure that Ollie's got around him at the moment, I think we're going in that direction. I think that's an important thing, really.
I think you're also seeing, and I don't like, comparing managers or setups, because all managers need to come into the club and have their own setup. But I think I really liked my era, obviously, is watching the way Warren Joyce and Sir Alex managed to work together to bring through those players and make sure that timing was right. And I think we'd always see with Warren, he'd always have a former United player as his number 2 in the reserve team as well. And I think that's a really nice way as well to get that next generation of coaches. Of course, Ollie famously was part of the reserve setup and the United coaching setup for a couple of years after he retired, and even in the latter stages of his career as well. So Alex said that he would just stand and watch and listen for a lot of the training sessions and really take everything in. I like now looking at the way Ollie is potentially working with Nicky Butt and those around him as well, to make sure that setup is correct and it helps those young players. I think, as you say, that's really key and important. And look, I say this all the time with the ones who question whether Maguire should be captain, whether Van der Beek should be playing, like all these questions and talking points that people like to have. No one knows the players and the team and the camaraderie better than the manager. So at the end of the day, who are we to question who the right person to captain Manchester United is? Whether Van der Beek should be playing or not? Of course, we can have an opinion on it. Of course we can. But at the end of the day, we've got to trust the manager, because the manager sees them train, he sees them off the pitch, and he spends nearly 12 hours of his 24-hour day around those players and within that atmosphere of the club. So, yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think Tony mentioned it earlier on. You've got to have trust in the manager. Roy, just ever so briefly, I want to give you a chance to talk about under Sir Alex Ferguson and the 90s. Any youth games stand out? I know you regularly went to youth games. Any moments stand out for you and players within the last 20 years or so?
Yeah, well, there was one player in that team that won the Youth Cup in the early 90s who always impressed me, and very, very few people will remember him. He was a left back called George Schweitzer, and he was a really terrific left back. I'd been brought up with Roger Byrne, Tony Dunn, Dennis Irwin, and people such as that, Arthur Albiston. But this guy, left back, was absolutely outstanding. And in some of the games, in my opinion, he was as good a man at the match as the one who got it. But I remember a Saturday afternoon, they played Tottenham and beat them 3-0. And we pulled Giggs back into the youth team. They played him, I think they played him more of a centre forward. Sol Campbell played for Spurs that day. And Nicky Barmby played for Spurs, and they were really highly rated. United won 3-0 that day, and you could just see that here was a really, really top side. I'd just like to make a point John's made very eloquently. You know, today, the younger fans and everything, we've got to win. Just realise that today there are 4 leagues in England. There's the Premier League, the Championship, Division 1 and Division 2, which to all buggers like me is still the first, second, third and fourth division. It's 4 divisions. There's 92 clubs, and today Manchester United are clear as second. Now, you know, everyone thinks we've got problems. The second of the 92 clubs. They're in the quarter-final of the FA Cup. They're in the last 16 of the Europa League, and they reach the semi-final of the League Cup or whatever. And obviously you want them to win cups. 4 semi-finals, I understand that. But hey, just imagine you being a fan of one of the other sides. We're second of 92. And we've got young players coming through, incredible. Watching the young side the other week when Choleteer and Ami played against Liverpool and they won. And there was another game, Blackburn, they came back from about 4-2 behind and won 6-4. Absolutely exhilarated to watch. And, you know, we'll be okay.
Can I also just give a shout out? And Tony, I was going to come to you on this, but we don't have much time. I want to come around with a couple more rounds of questions, if that's okay with you guys. So we do briefly on the next couple ones, but also a shout out to Finley McAllister, who became the youngest ever player to play for the under-18s the other night. 14 years old and 7 months, made his debut for the under-18s, which is... Did he look like an under-18, Tony?
I don't know if it's me getting older or them getting younger, but they're looking less and less like 18 every single day. I mean, good luck to the lad. We've got lots of injuries, and this is how people get their chances. You know, Marcus got his chance through an injury. You know, Charlton got his chance through an injury. You know, all these kids, they get their chances through injuries most of the time, and good luck to him.
I think what I saw I think you retweeted this as well. What's great about Finley McAllister is he doesn't just hold the record for being the youngest player for the under-18s. He also holds a record for being the youngest player to play at under-16 level as well, at 13 years old and 4 months. So there's one to watch potentially for the future, because clearly the club highly rate him to give him those accolades. And as you say, give him a chance to take it.
Let's not put too much pressure. He's probably got A levels or O levels to still get his out the way first. Before we start giving him too much stuff to worry about.
So what we're saying is Champions League football next year. Finley McAllister to make his debut. Let's move on quickly. And look, Tony, if my maths are right, 4,077 games is it now? Just over 80 years. Having an academy graduate involved in the matchday squad. Absolutely phenomenal, of which we've seen times when the full 11 to half the 11 to the subs bench being packed with academy talent. For you, what's the difference? And again, I know this could be a long conversation, but if we'll try and make these answers brief to this one, because I want to come around in a minute and do a round on the most exciting, a player you remember watching who's the most exciting from the Man United Youth Academy over your time, over your years. I just want to ask, what do you feel is so different now compared to back in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s to these young players coming through? What's the difference in the youth team setup and also in youth team football? Because obviously the old first division way back then was known for being so much more physical, you know, so much more tough, so much more rough and rugged. For you, is there what are the major differences now for young players coming through?
God, that's a great question. What's the major difference? I think some of the difference is the physicality. I think in the days, even going back to the old Central League in the late 80s, early 90s, you were up against men. So you were playing against men playing men's football, and that gave you a certain degree of savviness, if you like. And I think sometimes a lot of the youth players coming into the first team, it takes time for them to build that savviness on the pitch. The game is less physical as well, so that helps them to some extent. So I think that's some of the difficulties and the differences. I think the other difference is, as I just mentioned, Finlay McAllister, he's 13, 14 years old, and his name's in the paper, and you've got the whole pressure of social media and the pressure of the press, and that never happened. You know, Roy mentioned, seeing Arthur Orbison on a bus. There's stories of Duncan Edwards getting to Old Trafford on his bike. Players were just, they weren't anonymous, but they were left alone. They were able to just develop. I think there's a lot of pressure on children these days. And I remember talking to Paul McGuinness, the ex-United youth coach, saying to me a little while back, there's also premature professionalism in the game, where they're coming through an academy and the pressure starts from a very young age. And we expect them to be professionals at 7 and 10 and 15 and forget that they're children and that they have to learn how to play and make mistakes and have fun with their friends and play other sports and find their way. And I sometimes think that we put way too much, for them anyway, I think they must feel a lot of pressure in today's environment to come through the academy. And at least I hope at United, the infrastructure there, which I hope it does, and I think it does, takes the pressure off the kids and allows them to evolve and to progress in a developmental way rather than a results-based. I mean, I know results are important, but, certainly at junior levels, they try to take that pressure off children, which I think is really important. And I think that's a major difference, the physicality and the emotional pressure.
Yeah, so same question to you, Roy.
Well, yeah, those are the 2 points, physicality and social media. Those are the main difference. I mean, in the 50s, they got on the bus, Tony mentioned it there, with Arthur Albiston. They walked with the players, they walked with the fans after the game. There were local people. Social media is the biggest scenario now, because, like I've just said before, Manchester United is second out of 92 clubs, and if you looked on social media, we looked as though we're a rubbish side, and it's just not true. And that's a problem. Social media, but the physicality, as Tony said as well.
Can I jump in there, Roy? I've actually got a bit of an opinion on this, because obviously, social media sort of my thing. I understand that social media gets a lot of hate because of the way that it drives negativity sometimes, or the way it does drive pressure. I completely agree with you. I think you're spot on with that. But I think the biggest factor to all this is, and I'm going to say it, video games. Because everyone now that they play a realistic video game think that they're a football manager. it's as simple as that. And they think that they know the tactical book, they know how to be a football manager. And I personally think that it's video games, because, and I'll come back to it. So my nephew's 13 years old, is an Arsenal fan, is my least favourite nephew. But he'll watch this, by the way. But he will have a conversation with me now about the way Arsenal set up tactically, that even me, what would it be now, 13 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to have that conversation and use the terminology that he uses. And when he speaks to me like that, I just turn around, look at him, and go, but that's bullshit. If you win a game 1-0 and play crap, I don't care. Like, and this is the thing, and this is where I think the problem lies, is that you go and play FIFA, you play it for 10 seasons, Amad Diallo is 99 rated and is the best player in the world. So he should be playing every game right now, because that's what worked on FIFA. And I think that's part of the problem with this. It molds into the social pressure. But I also think that, unrealistic video games aid unrealistic expectations, which then make people think, and you'll see it now, there's so many tactical podcasts. Some are good, some are not. But at the end of the day, that's still an opinion, yet the way it's delivered is like it's a godsend. And it's really not in the grand scheme of things, because a football match can go one of three ways. You can either win, lose, or draw.
Ben, now here's the interesting thing, right?
Go on, Tony.
You put us on this show because of our experience and our knowledge.
Go on.
And now you're competing with us on stuff we have no idea what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You're providing you some knowledge and some.
I'm learning from you now because I've never played these games. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Honestly, I reckon I could be the next Manchester United manager with how good I am on Football Manager. But realistically, that's never going to go down well on a CV, is it? But still, look, each to their own and stuff. But I completely agree with you. I just think that, you know, social media platforms actually are a fantastic thing. And although they do drive some kind of negativity and they are difficult, they've got so many positives that I still think outweigh the negatives. But I think the whole drive around football and pressure and the way it's used, and it comes down to the way that you mentioned the pressure on footballers and bits and pieces like that, I really believe that does stem from video games. Genuinely, that's what I think. And it's the same now. My brother-in-law wants to join up in the army. Best of luck to him. He was glued to Call of Duty throughout his whole teenage life, and he thinks that's what army life is like. And literally, this is part of the problem with the generations who are doing it. John, I just want to come over to you quickly with a slightly different question to what the guys have just answered. I'm just wondering for you, how different is under-23 football, do you think, compared to how the old reserve team football used to be? We've all mentioned here about men playing against men. You know, we know in the old reserve team, if you're coming back from injury, Darren Fletcher will come back from injury and play a couple of games for the reserves with the young lads before going back into the first team. Now with the under-23s, that just doesn't happen. You don't see squad players anymore play at that level. Do you think that has a hindrance, or is that a positive for the young lads? Do you think that's had an impact on the way that players come through?
Yeah, I think it's disappointing, really, because I think we don't give enough emphasis on players playing for the under-23s. I mean, I was listening to Brian Robson talk recently. Actually, I put it up on one of my YouTube channels, and he was talking about how he was playing. He had to go and play in. I get confused about the names these days because they change the names. I mean, under-23s for me is the reserves, but he was talking about he was playing in the reserve team game. I'm not sure what he'd been classed as because of the name, but he was playing there with David Beckham and Paul Scholes and Gary Neville, and he was a captain of England and Manchester United, and he was in his 30s, and he's gone down to play at this level because he was getting his fitness back. And also Eric Harrison wanted him to tell him what he thought of the kids coming through, and he told this great story about he told a story about each one in turn, about how he realized, even though they were so young, that they had the maturity, that they were already, he knew they were going to be successful because of the way they thought and the way they talked to him. For example, Robbo won a free kick, and he fell on the ball and he's picking it up, and he's getting ready to put the ball down, and he hears his voice, and it's David Beckham says, "I take the free kicks." But Robbo was saying he knew he already had the confidence. This kid who was probably about 17, and Robbo's like 34, 35, and he's got this kid comes up, and he's already got the confidence to sort of grab hold of the ball and say, "I'm taking the free kick." And there was another little story about Paul Scholes. He'd been taken out by this sort of 6'5" defender, and he's been knocked into the middle of next week, and Robbo who's running in to sort of defend him and, you know, have a scrap with the guy. He's saying, "Are you okay, Scholes?" And Scholes says, "Why wouldn't I be?" And it's really the attitude. And I think, so what I'm trying to say really is I don't think we do put enough emphasis on the older players playing at that level and helping the younger players. I mean, that's the impression that I get. I mean, maybe I'm out of touch a little bit, but I missed a long era because I spent 27 years covering football for the Sunday Mirror. So from the sort of 80s, 90s, to 2010, I didn't really see a lot of youth team and reserve team football, so it's more a case of following it like a fan, really. So the other guys have been more knowledgeable in that respect, but I do have the impression that we don't really use those reserve team football, whatever you call it these days, as a I don't think we use it enough. I just think it's kind of dismissed, and that's one of the reasons I find it frustrating sometimes. That I think Roy mentioned it earlier, that we don't see, like, why does Mason Greenwood still play for the youth team, or for when we've got these big games, we don't seem to give it as much importance as it used to be. it seems that now when you're in the first team squad, you're in the first team squad, and you forget about the lower levels. And Duncan Edwards used to be playing in all the different teams. From what I've read and what I've heard people like Roy talk about him, he'd be playing for the Army, he'd be playing for the youth team, and he'd be playing for the first team, all possibly in the same week. And it seems to have changed. It seems to have evolved into something totally different these days. So I feel like we don't get the full value of some of these lower level, but obviously the whole structure is different. And the other guys, I think, would have more. I think Tony's probably more in touch with how it all evolves now from youth team to first team. But I get the impression, more from a fan point of view rather than an expert, that we don't really use these lower levels as much as we could be doing. That's just
a good point. Yeah, it's a good point, John. It's a really good point. I wonder, again, you know, you'd use this as a positive and negative. Is it fitness? Is it concerns wrapping players in cotton wool? But then what does that tell you about the players back then, how fit they were? That Duncan or a player that would go and play a game every 2-3 days. Like, it's crazy. We're moaning this season that we're playing so much football. Yeah, players would go and do that for youth team football and see it's just as important as the first team football. It's bonkers. Final point, guys. Loads of you in the live.
Frozen.
Should we carry on talking?
I think Ben's, yeah. I was going to say one thing. I remember Lou Macari talking about having too many games. He said if he told Jock Steen you can't play twice in a week, he'd be bombed out the club. I mean, nowadays we play 2 matches a week, and it's too much, isn't it? I think football, the attitude of footballers these days is totally different. But obviously, it's a totally different game. But
sorry about that. Thanks, John, for filling in. Yeah, sorry, thank you for that. I'm sorry. I think what's happening, I mentioned this before, I think every hour my internet likes to connect to a different internet, which is bonkers. But anyway, one final point, guys. If you're watching this, instead of like the video, get in the live chat. I want to hear one thing from everyone. I want you to just put it in the live chat. We're going to go around to the guys and ask them this question too, and I'm going to start. One player that you saw playing the United Academy, could be at any level, that you was most excited about getting a first team chance. Okay, that's something I'm going to hear from all the lads, and I'm going to start with mine. And this one's going to be slightly left field, and I'm only going to say this name because actually a tweet popped up from, let me go back here, the 6th of May 2014. Can you guys remember any youth team players that might have been coming through in 2014?
2014, so that would have been after Pogba, Morrison. Jesse Lingard would have been around about that time. No, he was.
It was that time, but it wasn't Lingard. So the person for me now, I used to go back and watch a lot of football.
Rossi,
not Rossi, no, but he's a striker.
I would have thought someone along the lines of, back in those days, Januzaj Pereira would have been around about then.
Same team as those guys. The player for me was, I went back and watched a lot of England in the 90s and early noughties. And one player that I always loved as a striker was Michael Owen. Even though he played for the Scousers, I thought he was just a tremendous striker. And how he'd doing it at such a young age. He just loved his movement off the back of a defender. Whenever he's in front of goal, you expect him to score. For about 2-3 seasons, watching him in the reserves, that was James Wilson. James Wilson was absolutely fantastic. The way he would score goals and that poacher's instinct, but also to 9 times out of 10, when he's on the shoulder of the defender, to time that run right is a phenomenal skill. And he'd done it time after time after time. I loved James Wilson, and I was so eager to see him get in the first team. To which even here, I've got the tweet. Look at that. Can you see that? I've always said it. James Wilson equals a young Michael Owen class. I sent that after a reserve game on the 6th of May, 2014. I was so excited about him. I thought he was the next. I thought he would play so well with, at that point, Rooney. I thought that the team was made for James Wilson to follow on that next couple of seasons. And he got that injury. And it tragically, he never really recovered, I think, after that knock that he took, because he never found that pace. And he always struggled. So slightly left field, but I'm going to say James Wilson, just because that triggered me, seeing that tweet, to how excited I was to see him progress. And I think he's at Salford now, isn't he? He's never managed to get back to that player. But that's who it is for me. Tony, what about you? Let's come over to you. And again, in the era, it's completely up to you. I know it's hard to pick one, but it'd be nice for us to reminisce.
Oh, man. That you asked at the beginning, and I'm thinking, God, who do I pick? Because, you know, the likes of Giggs and Whiteside automatically come to mind. But the one I'm gonna pick is one you've mentioned a couple of times, which is Darren Fletcher. I mean, I remember seeing Darren in a youth game back in about 99, 2000. And I just thought, this kid's got something. And the more I saw him, the more I liked him. And it wasn't just his ability on the ball. All the United youngsters are technically gifted. There was something about him. There was something about his maturity, his professionalism. There was something about Darren that I just thought, this kid is special. I really hope he makes it. And then when he did eventually reach the first team, I think you remember there was a story that Fergie wanted to play him as a 15-year-old in a first team game against Villa or somebody, and the Football League said, no, you can't. And that really even got me whetted my appetite even more, because now I was even more keen for him to get an opportunity. So when Darren hit the first team and he struggled in the first couple of years, I was delighted. And he turned into what I think being a youth player at Manchester United is all about. I think if you want one player who epitomizes what the DNA, we started the show with talking about DNA, I think it's Darren Fletcher.
Yeah, fantastic shout. Let's come to you, John.
Yeah, I've already mentioned earlier Norman Whiteside and Mark Hughes, but the other player that I probably remember, I can't go into the detail that Tony's just gone into, but Sammy McIlroy, because my boyhood era was Georgie Best, and when Sammy McIlroy came, I thought, well, crikey, he looks a bit like Georgie Best, and and he quickly got into the first team. So I remember Sammy McIlroy was the one that stood out for me as an exciting moment, and I've obviously followed his career and got to know him as a person. So Sammy McIlroy was one that stands out for me. But in the current team, I've always been quite impressed with Scott McTominay, and a lot of fans have said he's not good enough for United. But what I like about Scott McTominay is he's a player that's improving all the time. And for me, that's what Man United is all about. It's about making the kids better. And they don't all start as being superstars. They're not all going to be a George Best or a Bobby Charlton or a Duncan Edwards. But there are certain players who just get better and better and better. And I think that Scott McTominay is one of those players who's going to get better and better and better. And I think he's got the right personality as well. I think that's all part of it as well. It's not just about being skillful. It's about having the right attitude. I think that's one of the things that Ollie talks about, attitude of players. And that's why some players make it and some don't. A lot of us were very frustrated with Ravel Morrison because he never, he got too many wrong influences. But the opposite of a player like Ravel Morrison for me is Scott McTominay, who thinks like a footballer who's going to go right to the top. And I think he's a player that will go right to the very top.
I think it's interesting you say that as well. I think we're starting to see now that we've put Cavani around Greenwood, that we're actually starting to see Greenwood do exactly the same. He's starting to get better, and you're starting to see parts of his game that he's actually improving. And I think it takes a lot for a player at that age in the first team to show that consistent progress. And I think Scott deserves nothing but credit with the journey he's been on. Roy, what about you? One player.
I can't. Coleman,
two players.
Coleman,
I'll give you two players if you take 2 minutes to talk about each one.
Coleman, Edwards, Charlton, Georgie Best. Georgie Best is still the greatest footballer I've ever seen.
That's an incredible player. He's for the second names.
Yeah, and he, the 1964 Youth Cup team was very underrated. But Rimmer, Bobby Noble, a tremendous fullback, Fitzpatrick, Sadler, Willie Anderson, John Aston, who we forgot, man of the match in European Cup final, and Georgie. That was a great side. And George, the greatest footballer I've ever seen. End of.
Yeah. Great points, well made. Guys, we're going to have to leave it there. We've done well over an hour, but maybe we get this panel back together in a couple of weeks' time and we talk about something a lot more specific so we can have a proper roundtable conversation about a period maybe or about a certain player, potentially like we've done with the Manchester Munich Memorial Foundation, because it's been great chatting to you all and the insights you provide are massively appreciated. Go on.
Get this book. Anyone who watches United, Sons of United, that is the book. Seriously, magnificent.
There we go. Guys, thank you. Check out Mr. Mujac on Twitter. That's Tony. Check out John Gubba. And the Red Mancunians, isn't it, John? No, the Republic of Mancunians.
Man United, the religion is my kind of
Man United, the
religion. Cuts across all the social media.
Perfect. Thank you, John. And Roy Cavanagh, go and check out Roy MBE on Twitter as well, and some of his fantastic books as well. And some of the previous shows we've done as well. If you want to learn more about players of the past, and especially the babes, please go and check that out on our channel. Hit the subscribe button, like this video, and thank you guys for watching. Thanks again, Tony, John, Roy. Stay safe, guys. We'll be back tomorrow with former United Academy graduate, Daniel Nardiello will be joining me for our Wednesday podcast. Guys, take care. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Cheers.